All opinions and views expressed by the speakers are not representative of views and opinions of RBC Dominion Securities, Inc. All information and opinions provided in this video are in good faith, but without legal responsibility.
Mel, welcome back to another recording of the Reform Millennials pod. For the last couple months, I've been outrageously busy, but there's been two budgets, and one provincial and one federal. And hilariously, the provincial budget got less people mad. This federal one really has people up in a tizzy. And maybe that's just because of maybe what I do for a living. But I actually believe there to be a lot of people upset by this. And maybe I'm again in a bubble, but I think it feels to me it's like a government on its way out is doing the things that they wanted to do for the previous 9 years and know that this is their last shot. So without kind of diving too deep into things early, I would much rather have you kind of lay the land. Where are we sitting today? And what's likely going to happen over the next 16 months or 17 months before October 20th, 2025? And give us some reasoning for why they tabled this budget and these tax policy changes.
Yeah, so first of all, thanks so much for having me. It's good to be back. I love a fellow millennial that likes to talk politics and business. So it's just amazing to be here again. Yeah, I think you're right. This federal budget was not what we were expecting it to be. Now it's quite characteristic for the federal government, especially within the past several years, to sort of be releasing announcements leading up to the budget. And we definitely saw that. We saw several different announcements leading up to the budget on housing, on, a national school lunch program. And so by the time the budget finally was released on April 16th, and Chrystia Freeland stood up in the House of Commons and tabled it, there wasn't a lot in there that we hadn't sort of been prepped to be included in there. So the one thing I know that we're going to talk about, there's some small business changes that were really important, but I guess looking at this budget, there were no huge surprises in it because of the way that they chose to communicate it. But the Liberals are in a very interesting political spot right now. So they are, as you say, about 16 months out from an election next October. They are in a minority government situation with the NDP holding them up with their confidence in supply agreement. And they are polling more and more behind the Conservatives with every passing day. Leading up to the budget, they were polling behind the Conservatives, and there was just a poll released this week by David Coletto that suggests that lead that Poilievre and the CPC has held by more than 20 points. And so typically when a budget is released in the election years leading up, a government is hoping for a bump. A government is hoping for a budget to make the electorate think about them in a positive light, to continue to show their base of support that they're doing what they said they were going to do. And it doesn't appear that this has done that, at least by the polling perspective. And even just as you say, the anecdotal evidence that you hear when talking to different people in your network and outside of it.
Well, yeah, it feels that way. And again, I always am cautious to kind of broaden the experiences that I have, because of I'm in Alberta, and we often believe that how we feel is how the rest of the country feels, and it's that we couldn't be more wrong about that. But this time around, especially when you start to look at the polling data, and you're kind of confirming my priors. So I want to move into the not broaden in, or sorry, get too granular yet. I want to talk about revenue. You shared me with a few slides from your budget deck, and it surprises me a little bit. I'm looking at the revenue slide, and we're not sharing this with anybody. This stuff is just something you shared with me. But the personal income tax as a percentage of revenue for the country is shockingly high. Is that the case? And I don't know if you've done work on this, but is that the case for any other countries? Or are we uniquely high in that?
I think it's not uncommon, especially within a government system like Canada's, where so many public policy delivery responsibilities like healthcare and education, et cetera, are the responsibility of the provinces. The federal government has sort of limited ways in which it can raise revenue. It's on personal income tax, corporate income tax, the GST, and then certain, carbon taxes, and then employment insurance, and all these other types of sources. So there's very limited ways in which the government can raise revenues. And so when you're looking at a $500 billion budget, it is going to primarily come from that PIT and CIT buckets. I would have to look at how it compares with other countries. Definitely, it's more than you would be paying in the United States. Absolutely. And probably less than you'd be paying in some countries in Europe, for sure. So I would say that Canada is probably sort of mid-range, but for our closest neighbor in the States, it's definitely more on the personal and corporate side than you're paying in most states in the United States.
In some of the charts that were being passed around on Twitter and LinkedIn, it showed the marketable increase if this capital gains inclusion rate were to pass in our corporate or capital gains tax paid would be from bottom 5 in terms of ours being the lowest and incredibly competitive, all the way up to being the 3rd highest in the 30 most developed countries in the world. And that to me is a shocking change. To be so darn competitive from an entrepreneurial perspective, to then bump up into what would be comparable with Nordic countries like Denmark, it is a really, really stark change. And I don't know if they understand just how impactful that's likely going to be. The changes that they're making, it sounds like it's supposed to generate something in the range of $25 billion in revenue.
$20 billion over the next 5 years, so about $4 billion in this fiscal.
Okay, so that is mostly going to be found in personal income tax increases. Is that the idea?
So the capital gains exclusion rate is separate, obviously, from the personal income tax. So the capital gains exclusion rate will raise that about $20 billion over the next 4 or 5 years. But you make a really good point on competitiveness, because when we look at that capital gains, like essentially what the government has done is put a lot of their eggs in this capital gains basket. But in so doing, they've made a lot of assumptions, right? So they've made assumptions that people are going to continue to invest their money in the same way with these changes. And so they're crunching numbers on how much they think this will bring in revenue based on past behavior. But as you say, this change is huge and is definitely going to change the behavior of investors as they look at where they're going to put their money. So that's one of the things that I think is really interesting, is like these assumptions are made with the sort of idea that the same activity is going to continue even in response to these changes, which are not favorable to investors. So I think it's a really interesting point.
No, I completely agree. So the two things I want to talk about today is one being housing, which I believe is the core tenant policy, or rather issue that is facing government in our country. And I think that that's multifactorial as to why we have a housing problem. But without going there, the second I want to speak to is obviously the capital gains inclusion rate, the exemption that we have, and the competitiveness of it all. So I want to finish on housing and then kind of dive a little bit deeper on this capital gains inclusion rate, what it means. So correct me where I go wrong, but the increase in the capital gains inclusion rate is effectively, we're bumping it up from 50% to 66.67%. So how this all works and how this impacts people, it's being marketed as though it's a 0.13% effectiveness in terms of the grouping of people. So if we have 40 million, or let's call it 100 million people, it barely impacts anybody. And it's becoming quite clear as we start to suss out the actual policy that is a bull-faced lie. I mean, it affects me immediately, it affects literally 90% of my clients. If that's true in both ways, I think that they're lying to us. So now, for those that don't know, if you were to have a $10,000 capital gain, in prior to June 25th, 2024, you would pay tax based on the $5,000 of that $10,000 allotment. So you would get it reduced in half, and then you would pay your effective tax rate. Now, what they are proposing is that be increased to $6,667. So that may not seem like a lot on its face. What actually effectively happens to your total tax rate inside of your corporation? It goes from what is in Alberta and BC something to the tune of 29 to 31% is your tax rate on someone who's earning a good chunk of money, and it increases it by an aggregate or a total of 10%, which is enormous and very difficult to start to plan for when they only give you 2 months to include it. So you combine this massive, massive planning change for everyone who is self-employed in this country or someone who operates a business with the smorgasbord of problems they pushed on accountants when they were trying to get everybody to register their real estate for the last, 12, 16 months. And you have a very, very, very difficult landscape to be someone who is trying to employ people in this country. And I'm seeing nothing but very, very mad people on both sides of the aisle. And I struggle to see where they're coming from with this, because to me, this is a direct shot at the employment class, not the ultra wealthy, but the employment class of the country. And that being your physicians, your accountants, your lawyers, your small business owners like pharmacies, your oil and gas employers, so service companies, your pipe fitters, your electricians, anyone who operates a small business that ranges between 3 employees and 50. Not the Loblaws of the world, but the picks and shovels of our country. And I'm curious, from your perspective, where they're trying to. I understand they need more money because they're spending more, and you had alluded to earlier, they don't have a lot of levers to pull on. But why this one?
Okay, so much to unpack there. So you are so right. I think that the impacts on small businesses, because there's no like grace amount for small businesses. But even if we think about individuals, right? So the individuals usually have a $250,000 sort of like cushion per year. So if you sold a house, for example, and made $500,000 on it, that first $250,000 is not going to be counted, but that second half of the $500,000, $250,000 is going to be counted. The thing that I think is so interesting, and we'll talk about the small business tax, but like intergenerational, cabins or cottages that people have, people that are maybe our age, maybe don't have those things in their family, but maybe they've been passed down, et cetera. If your small business sells a product, et cetera, gets capital gains, that's one thing. But then if we look at something that you've had in your family that you're considering an asset and an investment that's, maybe your parents worked really hard to build that for you, that's going to be included as well. So you're also affected as an individual if you're selling a second home in that way too. And there's a lot of people, especially in Alberta, who have multiple properties and maybe don't have those in a corporation that are still going to be affected. You mentioned something about the employment class, which I think is really interesting. And this is the one sort of thing that I had trouble with in the messaging for this particular change. While it is true that this directly only affects a very small percentage of Canadians, I think there's a misunderstanding about, how this will affect those Canadians that it doesn't directly affect. So if you're a small business and you're now having to pay more taxes, say you sell a company or whatever you might be paying capital gains tax on, that's less money in your company, not just for you to make for yourself, but for you to hire people, for you to invest in innovation and growth. And I think, all of the stuff that we've seen on X over the past little bit is really pointing to that. A lot of companies are not necessarily taking these capital gains that they would have and, shoving them in their pockets for personal gain. I think on the corporate side of things, and you would know more about this than I do, I think the one sort of positive impact of this is that it does sort of, for those large corporations, discourage buybacks to the extent. But who knows? I mean, there's lots of sophisticated planning involved in those corporations. But all this to say, the reason why this is the change that was politically appetizing for the Liberals is because nobody understands it. All people understand is tax the rich. And they don't know what the rich is defined as. They don't understand the impacts that it has long term. And I think the Liberals are really depending on the fact that most Canadians just hear the word capital gain. I've never paid one in my life. I don't know what that is. I don't know who it affects, but it sounds like it affects rich people and they should pay more because I can't afford X, Y, and Z. So it's really sort of like this class warfare thing that I think they tried to plant in the seed of that. And you see it as well, like the budget is titled Fairness for Every Generation. You saw Chrystia Freeland in her budget speech multiple times influence the need for an activist government. So you really see them trying to speak to Gen Z and millennials to say, we're here for you. Don't listen to all these people that are greedy, is I think the message that they were trying to exude. And it works because most people don't understand this stuff and it's no fault of their own.
Yeah, I mean, I've spent the last 6 weeks getting caught up on how this is going to impact. I'm running models on client portfolios and financial plans to make decisions on rushing a capital gain, either crystallization, etc. And that's, to me, the underlying strategy here. They want us to force through sales of assets early so as to crystallize a huge lump sum tax owing payment, and then over the next 3 years it'll be rolled back and we'll be back at a 50% inclusion rate. Maybe that's their strategy, maybe it's not, but I think you're absolutely right in terms of the pitting of the classes against one another. And you've seen this tried and fail in the United States in many ways, where you've seen a 1% inclusion on buybacks and capital gains. But in what they've done here at Canada, it's definitely more pungent. It's definitely more effective in actually pulling capital out of the country. And this is where I have my biggest issue with the policy itself, and it's kind of two-pronged. The biggest problem in Canada that most people don't understand and don't get is that Canada has some of the most shallow capital markets in the world. And capital markets are non-public investing areas, but where people go for money if the bank isn't lending. So when you're in Canada or in the United States, you can go to either large family offices, big pools of capital that are not held and managed by their large banks. So in Canada, we have the big six, which National Bank, you have RBC, you have TD, CIBC, etc. And they are your funding group for all entrepreneurship in the country. We have such shallow exterior groups outside of our pensions, obviously, for pools of capital to raise, for entrepreneurs, for small business owners to sell into or go for loans, which makes it a very difficult country to start and found a business. And what this policy does, and this is what Toby Lidke, who is the CEO of Shopify, the most successful tech company in our country by a mile. And he's a massive employer. He's created over 1,000 millionaires in Ontario, in Ottawa. And what he is speaking to about, he tweeted about this the couple days after it went out, and he speaks to how impossible this makes employing high quality engineers and staff at his, because how people are compensated in today's day and age are via share grants. I represent a number of clients that work for big tech companies, and they are 70% of their employment income in some cases are via RSUs, which are shares. So their salary might be $80,000 to $350,000, and then the remainder of their income actually comes in the form of shares in the business in which they work for. And that income, if perhaps those shares go from $1 to $10, has now effectively, the tax you will owe, gone up considerably. But what's the key to that actually is the capital gains inclusion rate, the exemption rate in which you get off Canadian businesses, and then compare that to who we are competing with in the United States. And right now, we are seeing a mass exodus of brain talent to the United States, and we're going to see more of it if we continue to tax this group of people. And if I was an engineer of any sort, and I had the opportunity to work for a Canadian tech giant or a United States tech giant, based purely on this tax inclusion rate, I would move and go to the United States. And that's sad. I wouldn't have said that a year and a half ago. And right now, it's just making it more and more difficult to be a middle class, upper middle class, someone who has done well in this country. And the second leg to that, and in a lot of people want there to be Toronto, Calgary, Vancouver, Ottawa. They want that to be the next Silicon Valley. But the reason why Silicon Valley is great today is because of the founders of the first generation of technology companies having an exit, selling their businesses, and then reinvesting it in opportunities in those countries or in that city. So Silicon Valley has the deepest capital markets in the world. They have individuals that are funding individuals that are going and trying new, exciting things, and they're taking bets that the government just can't take. And to me, we have now effectively removed 33% of that money from entrepreneurs and people who believe in our country, believe in building things here, and then redirected it to Chrystia Freeland and Justin Trudeau and the swath of politicians that have never been good enough to create a business, but have been good enough to sell themselves as country leaders. And I think a lot of the country would agree, is a challenge. Are they better at allocating money in opportunity than we are? And we keep shooting ourselves in the foot, I think. So that's my long tangent as to why I am so frustrated with this most recent tax change, because it does nothing but make us less entrepreneurial and less productive. And that is the story of this 9-year government.
Yeah, and I think, you raised so many good points in what you've just said. I think that it's more from my perspective as well. Like, I'm a small business owner. I'm self-funding both of my businesses. I started with nothing. I don't think that we should be feeling bad for people who have done well, because there's obviously a lot of people who are really, really struggling to find work, to get jobs, to be able to afford homes. Those are real struggles. I think that the government understands that those struggles are real. I think that what the Liberals and the Conservatives and the NDP and others disagree on is the path to fixing that solution, right? So you have on the one side, you have the Liberals and many left-leaning governments across Canada believe that the solution is more government. Whereas I think you see governments on the right of center, so Poilievre and others across the country, that believe that the solution is more entrepreneurs, more small business owners, more innovation. And I think that what's disappointing to me about some of the effects that you've just described is that it's not as though we were doing well in this area in the first place, right? It's not as though we were on our way to becoming Silicon Valley already, and now we're just trying to, make sure we take a little bit off the top to benefit everybody else. That is not what the reality of this country is when it comes to entrepreneurship, innovation, and investment. We are already behind on productivity, GDP per capita. You see so many examples over the past few years of just looking at, when you break down Canada's GDP per capita, what a large percentage of that is a result of increasing in housing prices, which has nothing to do with increased efficiency or productivity, or increasing public sector employment, which of course we love nurses, public employees, doctors, people who are paid by the taxpayer. But when you're looking at those being the gains in productivity from a business perspective, I think it's really concerning, because not only are you missing out on the economic benefits of incentivizing that behavior, you're not incentivizing that behavior at all. You're creating sort of like good and bad within society. And what we need for even people who don't have their own businesses, we need entrepreneurs, people who are inside companies being innovative. And that just doesn't happen in the public sector in the way that it does in the private sector. And that's not to villainize the public sector. I believe in a strong public sector. I believe it should be funded. I believe that we should really care a lot about the people who are paid by taxpayer dollars. But when we look at what is actually generating the kinds of productivity that we see in the United States and elsewhere, not to say that there's not problems in the United States, there are, but if we're talking specifically about capital markets and entrepreneurship and innovation and GDP growth, that is concerning to me. And it's concerning to me that our generation and the generation that comes after us and after that are not going to have hope in Canada like they should for those opportunities. And we are just going to see that brain drain. And I think Canada is an amazing place to live. I think that we are so lucky here in so many ways. But we have to continue to maintain that edge on more than we are. And I don't think that there's a sense of urgency. I think that the government is stuck because they had to do a lot during COVID, much of which they should have done. And I don't have any criticism there, but this idea, this like MMT idea that a Canadian government can spend without any limitation is not accurate. It's not real. And we're seeing the impacts of that now.
Yes. You're actually seeing the impacts of MMT across the entire globe, with the exception of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And what the come to Jesus moment with regards to this MMT monetary policy is that if you aren't the reserve currency and you don't have the fastest and most stable consumer and GDP growth, you aren't able to print as much money as you want. And inevitably, you need to find people to buy the debt that you have to issue in order to fund your deficits.
And another big one in that policy is you need to be able to control inflation, which we clearly cannot at this point, right?
We are incapable of doing. So while Canada has, and I would argue is a leader in terms of the downward pressure of CPI, I think we've done a decent enough job in managing it. It is largely on the back of a decelerating consumer, decelerating efficiency of the working class, and that to me is a disinflationary position, not one in which is coming down because of competitive pricing, and that is a humongous concern and very recessionary. So let's move on past this the small business portion and the tax rate, because I don't want to go too far, but I want to touch on housing. This is I think the number one thing that people are thinking about going into the next election. I believe that it is the crux of all family problems in many ways. And for the last 9 years, at least, I've owned a home for that long, and the Liberal government has been in power for the entire period. The cost of housing has skyrocketed across the globe, but very much we've outpaced everybody in Canada. And the solution to that in Canada has been focused upon what I call demand side policy, which is to alleviate pressure in the wallets of people buying homes. So if you're a young person trying to buy a house, we will find money for you within our government coffers, whether it be your RSP that you're contributing to, or your FHSA or your TFSA. We're going to allow you to have access to that. And in doing so, we're also going to reduce the CMHC measures. We're going to extend duration on your mortgages, so the amortization going to 30 years. We're going to figure out a way to which we can lock you into that house, but get you into it. And what this has done to home prices has driven the price of that house to new heights, because affordability is becoming more attainable via these programs. What's not happening is more homes being built so that the price of homes comes down. We're trying to increase affordability by unlocking tax dollars and assets rather than building houses.
Mm-hmm.
And that is bass backwards, in my opinion. And the only way to properly do this, to me, is to increase the percentage of houses being built. And right now, what did we have? 1.3 million Canadians join the country last year?
Something like that.
Yeah, and 95% of that's immigration. So we're pumping the country full of people, which I'm a pretty big supporter of immigration. I think it is the we have to take a long look as to why we need this. We are not having enough children as millennials, in which case we need to fill our country with more people. So great. I think that is an awesome, kind-hearted thing that we are doing as a country. We're a beautiful place to live. So bring in hard-working new Canadians. Awesome. However, we've decided that we're not going to build enough houses. Some of the data, this is, again, it's just stuff I've been reading. I'm not sure how accurate this is. It's probably within 10% anyways. But the majority, like if we need 350,000 houses, we're only likely going to construct something to the tune of 25 or 30% of that number, which is not enough. What in this budget came out that covers these dismal housing economics? Because I didn't see anything.
So there's a few things, but again, the policy and the likelihood of successful implementation to have the intended effect are two different things, right? And I think that that's part of the challenge that this federal government has, is that they've waited a little bit too long to see how big of an issue this has been for Canadians. And now, like, it doesn't matter if it's a conservative government or a liberal government or an NDP government. It's like there is not a government in the world that can solve this problem in the next 16 months before the next election. Like, that's just the reality. Homes take time to build. There's regulatory. You have to incentivize investment into building homes, which, you know, again, when we're not incentivizing investment in that way, it's difficult. So they have like a few different measures that they've introduced to try to encourage more building. So some regulatory changes on building codes and having a rental protection fund, waiving GST on new apartments and co-ops, and investing about $600 million in affordable home construction. So they are doing the things that are required. It's a timing issue at this point, right? So we're taking in so many new Canadians, which is amazing for a growing country, but we also have to look at what kinds of support those new Canadians are going to need, right? So there's a difference between, Alberta's done an amazing job at welcoming Ukrainian newcomers, and Canada as a whole has done an amazing job at making sure that people who are in really difficult areas in the world have a place to go. But we have to be able to make sure that we can support those folks as they become new Canadians, and with all of the different things that come along with that, right? So, and if the immigration is coming from sources like that, we need to make sure that we're there for those new Canadians. And I just, the way that they have sort of gone about that is, I think, a little bit difficult. They have also, as you said, tried to introduce some new demand side measures. So 30-year mortgages. I actually really like the first-time home buyers. I mean, you could always do things with your RRSPs on your first home, but just the fact that they've expanded this first-time home buyers investment fund is amazing. And I think that that's like a really good policy. Credit where credit's due. I think that that's something wonderful that I think a lot of young people can contribute to and benefit from. But again, we're not really addressing the crux of the issue, which is supply, and the supply that's needed in the short term. We also have a situation where young people, so millennials and Gen Z, want these changes to happen, but people who are established, say our parents' age or older, many of them, especially in big centers, like when I lived in Vancouver, this is the case, and I have lots of friends in Toronto where this is the case. A lot of people in this lack of productivity growth in Canada over the last 10, 20 years have looked to their home as their nest egg. And so those people don't want to see their home prices stay stagnant or go down. And so and those people vote most of the time, right? And those people are involved in decision making, right? So I think it's a very interesting, a very difficult problem for the government to solve, because also so much of housing development is municipal and provincial. And so you need to work with the provinces on that. And the way that, not to get off on another tangent, but the way that this government has chosen to work with certain provinces is not, the most collaborative. It's can many times, even though they've done a lot of work to support investments, has been very command and control, especially as it relates to environment and climate change, which is a whole separate issue. But again, acknowledging the need to work with these other jurisdictions of government. And so you end up with a situation where the fault for why we don't have the supply is probably equal parts municipal, provincial, and federal. But the feds are the ones that are going to the election next year. I mean, in Alberta, we have municipal elections in 2025 too, but they're the ones that are being asked what they're going to do about this, because they promised a strong middle class in 2015 when they were elected, and that is waning by every year. So that's, I think, the political struggle. Exactly. And again, we've talked about this before. What is the middle class? Like, I think we all have this number. I don't know. Brock and I were talking about this. Like, remember when we were growing up, it was like, oh, if you make $100,000 a year, you're good. And it's like, if you live in a large center and have a couple of kids, and like, that's oftentimes not enough for a family anymore. And so we kind of have these ideas of what is enough with inflation and rising cost of housing and all of the things that we're dealing with today. But those numbers, if you actually did a spreadsheet, like that's tough for many families, and many families aren't even making that much. So it's tough.
Yeah. The middle class is such a interesting term, because it suggests that it's the middle of the income distribution. But I think when you think about it a little bit more, and you say, well, maybe the middle class is the nuclear family, and maybe it's not then, because depending on the political party, that's not even something that is brought up in conversation. So if it's not that, then is it just housing affordability? Because to me, when I define the middle class, I don't use the middle of the distribution. I think that that's an ineffective way. It should be the affordability of a regular life. And how you define regular life is, again, dependent on you and your individual situation. But to me, it's probably home ownership. It's probably having the ability to get to work, and it's good health care, and the regular 40-hour work week. And whether or not you choose to have children or not, that to me is the middle class. And in Canada, the affordability of that lifestyle has not improved by definition, if that is that definition. Now, who and how you define it will obviously change, but by my math, it hasn't. And how we go about reigniting our middle class, the core drivers of our country, it's pretty stark, the difference between the three parties and how we're going to accomplish that. Canada is dividing itself more and more as we immigrate more people, and as we become a little bit more toxic from a political perspective. And I'm a little bit concerned. I don't know. I'm usually the most optimistic person when it comes to Canada. And me talking with your partner for 3 years every week, we tend to kind of fall in the same camp that way. And now I'm very upset by the position we're in. I don't like how the anecdotal evidence I have, and the people that I am living around, how they're struggling with housing, how the young people that I speak to are their optimism about their chances at owning a home, having the life in which they expected by being born here in Canada and or immigrating here. That story needs to change.
It needs to change, absolutely. The thing, though, that keeps me optimistic, even though I look at this data all day, every day, and like it doesn't feel or look good right now, the thing that keeps me optimistic is there's this tendency in politics and economics to think of the present moment, if it's difficult, as having never happened before. There's a very good book that came out during the financial crisis. I think you and I have talked about it a lot, called This Time is Different, by two Harvard professors. They look at 10,000 years of financial crises, and they suggest this time is not different. There are the exact same conditions. We live in a cyclical world. And so I think this is probably not the best advice for people who are really, really struggling, like hand to mouth. But I think if you're even a little bit outside of that, the best advice I think I can give to people is to study those patterns and have that help determine what you do next. We're 2004. Like if we look back 100 years, we were in 1924, the Roaring 20s. I'm not.
Don't look at the 30s, Mel.
I know. I'm not suggesting that I know what comes next, but I'm just saying if we look at those patterns in the past, like what we do know is that there are always really tough times, and those really are significant and completely real for a lot of people, everybody. But I think for me, I just try to look at the long term and govern myself accordingly, knowing that there's not really anything new that happens in human nature and in economics and politics and government. And so, there's all these nuances that we can discuss. And I think the government probably should be paying a bit more attention to those cyclical tendencies and sort of responding based on what is likely to happen versus what they want to happen. But as an individual, at least, if you're able to just just even think of that a little bit and just stop listening to the politicians, stop listening to the people who have, vested interests in selling you a certain narrative, and just look at what's happened in the past, that gives me some degree of comfort. But maybe I'm just delusional and wanting to be happy and not being realistic. That's also very possible.
The one reality of a entrepreneur and a successful one, like one of the truest things, is that we are delusional. So, and we have to be. And you know what? I tend to fall in the same camp as you, and I'm optimistic about Canada. It is still one of the greatest places on earth to live. However, I would like the treatment of those that are daring enough to be a little bit delusional and believe in themselves and believe in the country. I wish that they would incentivize them more. As the late great Charlie Munger said, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. Stop incentivizing those that perhaps don't employ, and incentivize those that do, those that create, those that have made our country great for the last 100+ years. And we will continue to benefit from it. Now, whether or not that happens, I don't know. I'm going to continue to bet on it. I'm sure you will too, Mel. In closing, I would love to get a little bit of a forward look in terms of, will this, as tabled, pass? And what's the likelihood of there being any changes if a new government were to form in 16 months? I'd like to get your opinion on that, nothing more.
Okay. So this budget will pass, as much as we'll hear Jagmeet Singh talk about how he's sort of made the government invest in certain things. Like we do see investments in pharmacare, but it's very targeted towards sort of select areas of pharmacare. And Jagmeet Singh sees the polling numbers that are available to everybody, and he knows that the next election is going to bring nothing but disappointment for the NDP in all likelihood, unless they do something magical and pick up a bunch of Liberal support, but that's unlikely. So this budget will pass, probably with not very many adjustments. The next budget that we will see will be next spring. And then, the government could technically fall at any time, but it probably won't until next October when the next election is scheduled. And then you can be sure that pretty much everything that this Liberal government has done, with the exception of probably some of the things around first-time homebuyers and other sort of universally supportive supported policies and investments, you can bet that pretty much everything is going to change if it's a Poilievre government. Hopefully in the direction that incentivizes some of the things that you and I have chatted about today. But again, your policies are only as good as your ability to implement them in a timely fashion. And we have very short memories as voters, and we're not very patient. And it's very difficult to look 5 years ahead when you're struggling to afford groceries today. So, yeah, I think we can expect a lot of change, but I don't think we're going to see any of that change in this budget.
Yeah, no, that's great. I do appreciate you kind of shedding some light there, because I'm of the opinion that I don't even think we'll get any sort of verbal policy from the conservative side of the aisle because of it not really being an effective way of maintaining their polling lead. Just continue down, be quiet, let them their popularity wane, and don't show your cards too early. So I think we're going to be in the dark for a while. There's going to be a lot of policy or planning from my perspective and accounting firms' perspectives. There's going to be a ton of financial planning around this new budget and new policy. And with our fingers crossed, we're going to go into the next election and hope that we get some alternatives. But it's oftentimes very challenging to see any sort of tax rollbacks, right? Is Poilievre Donald Trump? I don't think so. So who knows? We'll see.
Yeah, and it's important to note too, especially on the capital gains inclusion rate, like it was a Mulroney government that in the past increased this rate. And actually, there's Trevor Toome, an economist of the University of Calgary, has a lot of great work on explaining how, increasing the capital gains inclusion rate could be, a good policy if you also decrease personal income taxes and taxes elsewhere, right? So just because—
Thank you for including that part.
Yeah, so just because Poilievre may or may not roll back the capital gains inclusion rate doesn't mean that he might not make some other choices that might make that change that the Liberals introduced make more sense. So you're right. I don't think we're going to hear them being too prescriptive on anything, but I think they'll continue to sort of hope that the vibe is not where the Liberals would hope it would be. And yeah, it'll be a very interesting— you cannot predict politics, especially not 16 or 18 months out in advance. So I don't attempt to, but it's been really fascinating to watch how everything's unfolded.
Yeah, they've held their polling lead for a very long period of time. And it seems as though whoever is advising this current Poilievre government, or call it leadership, is doing a pretty good job of keeping him constrained inside of his talking points. So I always find conservatives shoot themselves in the foot by showing their cards too early, and then the counter or the other side of the aisle is able to pick them apart and really cast doubt on what they're going to be able to do and whether or not it's actually helpful for the average Canadian. So I'm optimistic about Canada. I'm a little bit saddened, and the next half a year is going to be challenging. But Mel, thank you so much for coming back on. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. And yeah, I best of luck to everybody listening. This too shall pass.
All right. Have a good and lovely weekend.
Thank you.